If you were to ask us or any other long-term Berserk fan what got them hooked to the series, they'd tell you that it's the way it started and never took its foot off the pedal. Berserk has one of the best opening sequences to any dystopian dark fantasy manga we've personally read, because Miura-sensei kept it short, informative, and most importantly, utterly destructive. The Black Swordsman arc is canonically set 2 years after the eclipse, but it's the perfect introduction to the life of a man that walks the line between life and death, because it immediately shows us the consequences of that life. The unhinged, do-or-die attitude of this man, whose name itself was Guts, pulled us into his tale of revenge against demonic angels. And by the time it was over, we couldn't wait to find out why he wanted to fight them so badly. In this video, we're going to recap the entire Black Swordsman arc in anticipation of the many fantastic fan animations that are about to hit our YouTube feed soon. So buckle up if you need a refresher course, because this is the ultimate one. Koka City, Snake Baron, and an elf called Puck, our first encounter with the Black Swordsman. Kentaro Miura knew he had one shot at capturing the imagination of his audiences, so he came up with the idea of a rather gimmicky, badass swordsman who wields an oversized sword. But unlike the giant blades that had come before Berserk, Miura wanted his to feel like something a human being could only wield if they pushed themselves to strongman levels of strength training. Moreover, he wanted to give him design elements of his own that made him stand out without unsheathing his sword, and the result was Guts' prosthetic arm cannon, his injured right eye, and the Dragon Slayer. In the Berserk prototype, Miura had Guts wearing an eye patch over his bad eye, but we're glad he ditched that because it would have made the iconic Black Swordsman look like a funky pirate. His main character was a walking mercenary barrack, stockpiled well enough to start a war on his own, so once he had Guts' character design down, he needed an impactful introduction. What better way to get your young adult seinen manga readers hooked to your series than starting it off with a sex scene? Berserk opens with Guts knee-deep inside of an apostle, who attempts to eat him shortly after she thinks she has him. But that isn't the only thing that sells us on the series. Back in the early days of Berserk, Miura would include full-fledged pencil-shaded panels in his chapters, which really showed off his skill as an artist. The first 4 pages of the Black Swordsman chapter are completely pencil-shaded, which makes the title spread showing the succubus grabbing Guts in her arms mid-coitus feel that much more intense. Usually, when a demon snags a human prey in such a predicament, they manage to eat them without interference. What's more is this was all unfolding in the middle of a forest, with no one around to assist the man should he want help. The succubus thinks she's won, so she tells Guts to enjoy his last taste of heaven before going to hell, but being the main character, he obviously turns the tables on her. The Black Swordsman holds the female apostle's ugly mug in place with his one good arm, shoves his cannon arm into her mouth, and pulls the thread that fires it shut. The next thing we see is him getting dressed, confirming his kill, and then walking off into the night. Within 5 pages, Miura established Guts' character, his tenacity, his motivations, and the lengths to which he'd go to achieve his goals. The rest of the chapter elaborates on all those things by showing us the utter desolation he was capable of inflicting upon the world. After killing that succubus, Guts enters a town that's overflowing with beggars, knights, mercenaries, and working women. This is a place that has seen war in recent times, and has thus become a den for the worst kinds of people. On his way through the gate, he notices a wagon carrying women and children, making its way to the castle that overlooked the whole thing. The scene then shifts to the town's inn, where we see a bunch of bandits playing darts. Only the darts were throwing knives, and the dartboard was a captured elf. Berserk was probably meant to be a hard fantasy series at the time of its conception, because the people that populated the inn weren't shocked in the least by the fact that a magical creature was in front of their eyes. They spoke about the captured elf situation in a way that it made it seem like elves were a common thing in this world. As the series progressed, Miura must have realized that this won't work for too long, because it messes up the mystique of the astral world, which is one of the key things that makes Berserk such an interesting read. We think that's the reason he came up with the idea of the incarnation ceremony being the starting point of the merger between the worlds, because it's only after that ritual that the appearance of magical beasts becomes commonplace. It also retcons the elf's presence in the Inn of Koka into being an act of causality, because that winged wonder was none other than Puck. As he struggled to get free of his bonds, the townspeople regretted his predicament and mused about how not even the mayor could stand up to these thugs from Koka Castle anymore. That's when Guts enters the scene. He pays the barkeep and apologizes in advance because he was about to mess things up. He pulls out a mini crossbow from his supply bag, straps it to his metal arm, and starts peppering the bandits bothering Puck with arrows. He kills most of them, but leaves a couple alive because he needs to send their leader a message. He wants the bandits' leader to know that the Black Swordsman was here, and then, to prove the fact that he lived up to his name, he sliced an ambusher in half with his massive blade. Dragon Slayer might not have been drawn as wide and cumbersome as it looked in the later arcs of Berserk, but its sheer size still conveyed its lethality. It was still too big, too rough, and too heavy to be called a sword. Indeed, it was like a slab of raw iron, but as long as it got the job done, that's all that mattered. And when it came to killing, Guts' Dragon Slayer was capable of living up to its name. He left the inn once he had confirmation that his message would be conveyed, and Puck followed him out, echoing our thoughts about his blade with his own monologue. It was the duality of these two traveling companions, brought together by the threads of fate, that kept Berserk from feeling like a straight-up horror fest. Puck was as talkative as Guts was stoic. In his first 5 panels, he'd spit out more lines of dialogue than Guts had across the entire chapter. Elves in Miura's world are combined with fairies, so they're supposed to be all hyperactive and mischievous. That much is evident in the way that Puck advises Guts on how to treat people he's just rescued before even introducing himself. He goes on to express his fascination with the swordsman's sword, and then gives us a quick rundown of how he got captured by those thugs in the first place. Puck is a great expositional character because he also ends up giving Guts important information on how Coca came to be ruled by bandits. Apparently, the mayor had struck a deal with their leader, where, in exchange for tributes, he was guaranteed the safety of his people. According to Puck, that stopped the raiding for a while, but with what Guts had done in the inn earlier, those raids were sure to begin again. He was about to advise Guts to skip town if he didn't want to get captured, but before he could sit on his shoulder, the Black Swordsman swatted him away. Guts tells Puck to not touch him unless he wants to get squashed, and this ticks off the elf, because he was just trying to help the guy. What kind of person acts stuck up with someone whose lives they saved? Puck didn't get that kind of behavior, so when Gus was surrounded by the guards of Coca, he was more than happy to make his escape. The Black Swordsman was thrown into the town's prison cell, where he was tortured and questioned mercilessly, but this wasn't Gus's first dance with pain. He'd been whipped and cut open from a dozen different places, his blood was pooling around his feet, and yet he didn't so much as flinch at the torturer's swings. The man who was supposed to be in control of the whole thing felt like he was the one being tortured, and Gus further antagonized him by spitting blood in his face. Before he could go any further, the torturer was interrupted by the mayor, who had shown up in the hopes of making Gus understand the gravity of what he'd unleashed on his people. Instead, he ended up getting exposed as a coward who struck a deal with the demon that eats human flesh. The mayor of Coca had assumed that Gus had no idea what his new master was like, but he had no way of knowing that this man he was torturing had been hunting demons like said master for 2 years. He should have figured it out when he saw just how many weapons Gus was carrying with him, because no person that was looking to fight another person would be traveling with such heavy artillery. Besides his sword, Guts had a mini crossbow, a belt of throwing knives, 2 separate daggers, gunpowder, and cannonballs, and more arrows than a siege defender during the Middle Ages. He could have truly started a war just by himself, but these weapons were the bare minimum for fighting creatures like the one residing in Coca Castle. The mayor tried using ignorance as a weapon, but it was turned against him when Guts exposed his real motivations in striking an alliance with those thugs. Though he was tight-lipped and stone-faced throughout the entire walk, where Puck annoyed him with his yapping, Guts was listening to the elf, and he understood immediately what he meant when he said the mayor paid tribute to the thugs. He'd crossed those tributes at the gates when he was entering Coca, and he knew that the mayor had only made that deal to save himself, not the people he claimed he was saving. This made the old man keel over in hypocritical pain, and he commands his torturer to do whatever he wishes with Gus, but to keep him alive, because he would be judged by the Baron. He also told his men to prepare a carriage so he could head over to Coca Castle and personally apologize for this fiasco. Perhaps he thought that by doubling the tribute amount, he'd be able to keep himself safe, but he underestimated the bloodlust of an apostle. While the mayor was making his way to the castle, one of the thugs that Gus had spared from that inn massacre relayed his message to the Baron, and as soon as he heard the words Black Swordsman, he started wondering whether this could be him. We catch a glimpse of the armor that gives him his namesake sitting on a chair beside him at the dinner table, an elaborate suit whose helmet is shaped like the head of a cobra with its hood open and its fangs drawn. The Snake Baron was keenly aware of the human who was known as the Black Swordsman and had been hunting down apostles like him for some time now. He wanted to test this swordsman's strength for himself, so by the time the mayor arrived, no proposal of gold or women could have satisfied his bloodlust. He has the mayor thrown in prison for being foolish enough to believe that he needed a reason to kill. The Baron's only thrill in life came from the joy of killing humans, so the arrival of the Black Swordsman was an excuse he didn't need to destroy the town of Coca, but he was more than happy to exploit it. In the meantime, we see the target of his wrath writhing in pain inside of his jail cell on the other side of town, and he's so injured that he can't even move his body. As he's struggling to get up and escape, a demonic-looking baby appears on his straw bed and starts crawling toward him. Gus clearly recognizes the kid because he quietly curses its arrival in his head. He also screams at it to get away from him as it draws closer, but before it can reach him, they're interrupted by Puck, who's returned to repay his debt to Guts. The elf slips inside of his cell with the keys to open the door and his bonds. Apparently, he'd put the guard under some sort of sleeping spell, and now he was going to use another to heal Guts. Puck was confused as to why his new friend was so averse to touch, but luckily for him, his healing didn't require touch. He rubbed his wings together and let the wind carry his elf dust toward Guts's wounds, which started healing rapidly. While he was at it, he also explained his other power as an elf, which included sensing others' emotions and even being able to alter them to an extent. But he was grateful enough to let Puck stick around and continue with his constant yapping. The elf went on to ask Guts why he'd come to Coca, what beef he had with the Baron, and why he had a funny-looking crest seared into his neck. The Black Swordsman's response didn't quite answer any of them, but dropped enough hints for us to piece together the bigger picture. This brand would pretty soon draw out the leader of those bandits, who will try to kill Guts and treat the townsfolk as collateral damage. It takes Puck a moment to realize that this had always been his plan, but as it dawns on him, Guts' emotions start pouring into him. The Black Swordsman answers the elf's question of whether he was fine with letting others die for the sake of his mission by stating those who get caught up in someone else's war and get killed are small fry. If a person didn't have the strength to live life on their terms, they might as well pass away. And this intense philosophy of his sets Puck's chest ablaze. Rage, sadness, and fear, these are the emotions that he picks up from Guts' speech. And another emotion buried deep underneath them, which isn't mentioned yet, but is confirmed to be ecstasy at a later point in the story. Just the fact that he feels ecstatic at the prospect of fighting demons that eat humans should tell you he's half demon himself. Puck tries to find some redeeming quality in this person he just helped out of a sense of elven duty by asking him why he saved him, but it only made Guts burst out in laughter. To him, saving Puck was an unintended consequence of delivering his message. He found it hilarious that the elf thought he would spend his time rescuing bugs like him, and this yet again hurts Puck's feelings. He headbutts Guts' jaw by flying into it, and then flies out of his cell with tears in his eyes. The Black Swordsman clearly isn't used to things like morality and people caring for his well-being. He wonders why Puck would involve himself so much in someone else's affairs, takes a look at the keys he left behind, gazes at his own recovered body, and scratches open one of his wounds again. Guts can't even receive help and treatment on someone else's terms. He'd rather bleed than be healed by something he could crush to death with one hand, and it didn't even have to be his mechanical one. Just as he's reminding himself of the pain and hatred that truly fuels his existence, he hears a fire break out in the town square, and his brand of sacrifice starts bleeding. This drives all other thoughts out of his mind and brings ecstasy to the forefront, because Guts licks his own blood while muttering that he'd been waiting for the Baron with a sickening smile on his face. The POV then shifts to Puck for a brief moment as he flies across the burning town of Coca. Witnessing the brutality of the Snake Baron's soldiers makes him sick to his stomach, but when he sees the Baron drinking the blood out of a corpse, he figures that this guy isn't human. Just as he gives his men the command to burn everything to the ground, Guts ambushes them from underneath a pile of corpses with his signature crossbow. He cuts down an approaching horseman and his horse with Dragon Slayer before coming face to face with his target. Despite hating his guts, pun intended, Puck can't help but be impressed by his strength. The same can't be said for the Snake Baron, who, despite witnessing the carnage Guts was capable of firsthand, ended up labeling his purpose pure folly. It felt like the empty boasting of a runaway crook when Guts shot him off his horse using nothing but his rapid-fire crossbow. He didn't even have to bring Dragon Slayer into play to drive the Baron into a wall-shaped corner. The latter's men were shocked that their leader could withstand so many arrows being fired at him from such a close range, but they're clearly unaware of his true nature, because when the Baron emerges in his true demonic state, all of them freak out and abandon him as quickly as they can. In this form, he looks like an anthropomorphic king cobra with a ridiculously disgusting face design, but what he lacks for in beauty, he more than makes up for with his strength, because the Baron has a clear upper hand over Guts in their initial engagement. He thrashes the swordsman about like a rag doll, and he's impressed by the human's resiliency. Most people would have died after the first blow, and here he'd survived 4. The Snake Baron gave him his props, but when Guts looked like he'd had the life beaten out of him, he expressed his trademark disgust at how pathetic humans were. The Baron was gloating and telling Guts that food should learn how to act like food, because he was sure he'd beaten him within an inch of his life. But turns out, the Black Swordsman was playing possum. Guts was faking being unconscious so that the Baron would let his guard down long enough to eat a face full of cannon fire. He then picked up Dragon Slayer and bisected the snake for his reptile dissection project, but instead of mercy killing it, Guts wanted to keep it alive. He clamped the Snake Baron's snake mouth down over his real face and shut it up with a hail of arrows. As he did so, he extolled the virtues of the human spirit, which wanted to keep living even after enduring endless traumas and pain. The Black Swordsman was about to give this undying apostle a taste of that pain, and in exchange, he wanted only one thing: the location of the God Hand. The Baron had lost all his arrogance by this point, and he begged Guts to save him from death, saying that it wasn't for apostles like him to know such things. But that only sealed his fate more firmly. Guts noticed that a burning beam was about to collapse on top of the dying apostle's head, so he just left him to his fate, telling him to savor every moment of it. As he gathered himself and departed Coca, Puck surveyed the utter destruction his actions had brought to the town and called it Berserk, thus christening the series. If this section felt way too long to you guys, well, that's because it was. The Black Swordsman chapter took up the entire first volume of Berserk when it was published, but that makes sense, considering it set up so many things for the future of the series. This one chapter told us that Guts was a man on a revenge quest against something called the God Hand, and he was hunting down their subordinates called apostles to get to them. He had a brand on his neck that acted as a homing beacon for demons, and he wasn't interested in taking help from anyone, which Puck learnt the hard way. Guts had the weapons load up to take on an entire army by himself, and this concept of collateral damage was so skewed that he was willing to sacrifice an entire town for the sake of his mission. We saw him go from one target to the next in rapid succession in the first chapter, so it was hard for us to understand just what drove him to such extreme lengths. That became clearer in Chapter 2, which is conveniently titled The Brand. The Night of Demonic Miracles, The Brand of Sacrifice debuts. The opening sequence of The Brand is shorter than the previous chapters, but it sets up the topic to be addressed pretty handily. We see Guts walking through the woods, still injured from his fight with the Baron, fighting off what appear to be evil spirits. These spirits keep telling him that he can't escape them, but given what we saw from him in Chapter 1, we'd say he wasn't the type to run anyway. When the sun came up, the spirits melted away, but were replaced with another problem, Puck. Turns out, the elf had followed Guts all the way from Coca in an attempt to join him on his travels. At first, he thought that the swordsman had been attacked by wolves or something, because he couldn't see him on the path that he was supposed to have taken. His suspicions about a wolf attack become stronger when he did spot Guts, because the swordsman's wounds from his apostle fight had opened up again. Nothing else made sense to him, considering they were in the middle of a forest. Guts was thoroughly annoyed by the bug's reappearance, and he asked him why he was following him around. Puck responded by saying Guts' life seemed interesting to him, and he figured if he stuck around, he'd see all sorts of neat things. The Black Swordsman flung the elf into a puddle upon hearing that, and warned him to stay away, because he was in no mood to become entertainment for an elf. He didn't like elves, and he didn't like Puck. If he got in his way, Guts wouldn't hesitate to kill him, and with that, he took his leave. Puck once again couldn't believe his apathy, and started cursing him out, but what was more surprising was that the fact that their paths ended up crossing coincidentally later on in the chapter. As Guts was walking through the rain, a covered wagon pulled up on him, and his driver offered him shelter. The Black Swordsman refused the offer for his sake, because he didn't want to put any lives that weren't his own in jeopardy, and this guy had his daughter with him. The driver insisted, so he thought claiming he was haunted by evil spirits would get him to back off, but that only increased his insistence. Turns out, this guy was a priest, and besides, he was carrying a lucky spirit with him. Puck. The elf makes a face at Guts upon their reunion, and the swordsman decides to take the old man up on his offer, because he personally had nothing to lose. The same couldn't be said for the people that offered to help him, though in his defense, he did warn them not to. After having a brief scuffle with Puck, Guts has some of the wine that the wagon driver's daughter Colette offers him and passes out rather quickly. Makes sense, considering he was fighting day and night for the most part, and he must have been exhausted after his battle with the Snake Baron. But even sleep didn't give him any rest, for his dreams were haunted by demons. As soon as he closed his eyes, Guts saw himself running down a narrow canal with a massive floating eye watching his every move. His sprint comes to an end when steel spikes appear from out of nowhere and impale one of his feet. His brand starts bleeding, and he hears a voice telling him he can't run from us. This voice belongs to the same demonic baby we saw in Guts' jail cell in Coca, only within his dreamscape. Its size is huge. We don't know it at the time, but this demon child is haunting Guts not because it's a demon, but because it's his child. Like the overall setting of his series, we're pretty sure Miura was experimenting with the demon child's plotline during the early stages of Berserk, because in this dream, his appearance is equated with an apostle's. His words echo the ones that dead spirits taunt Guts with on a daily basis, and we don't even know why he hates this kid in the first place. We later find out that Guts tried to kill him because of his nature shortly after his birth, but without that knowledge, anyone would think this kid is just one more demon for him to worry about. The sight of his demonic baby jerks Guts out of his nightmare, and he realizes that it was being induced by an incubus, an astral creature born from the mixed blood and sexual fluids of those who died filled with hatred and malice. Guts kills the incubus with his dagger and mocks the priest for being shocked by its appearance. Before he went to sleep, the pair had a short discussion about the life of a mercenary, and the priest disapproved. He felt that killing to make a living was an unclean profession. One of his nephews had run off to become a merc, and he got himself killed in battle when he could have had a family of his own. The priest was clearly someone who believed in society's definition of a good life. Guts was different. He refuted the priest's assertion that his nephew's decision was foolish by saying that it didn't matter as long as he was happy doing what he wanted to do. In his mind, the man died happily living out his dream, and this was something that a scripture-abiding crone like the priest simply wouldn't get. That's why Guts mocks the priest for being shocked at the incubus's appearance, because he believed in God, but not in evil spirits. Puck was the one who asked the relevant question in this scenario, inquiring as to why this thing showed up in front of them at this time and in this place, and Guts responded by touching his brand. The brand of sacrifice wasn't a simple homing device that told Guts the location of an apostle by bleeding when it came within their range of influence. It was a magnet for misfortune. When Guts wasn't hunting apostles, he was busy fending off evil spirits and creatures like the incubus, because the brand attracted all evil things toward him. As a sacrifice, Guts' body and soul had been promised to demonkind. So long as he breathed, he'd attract evil spirits and worse to himself, because to them, he was like a shining beacon of light. Dead spirits in Berserk crave bodies of flesh so they can act on reversing their regrets. No matter how futile that attempt might be. But in the end, they're all thralls to demonkind, so Guts had no choice but to fight them off. The incubus's appearance meant that things were about to get dicey real soon, and as if on cue, Guts' brand starts bleeding. The moment that happens, he stops the wagon and gets out, gripping his sword in anticipation of an attack from what are basically zombies. He tells his companions that somewhere nearby there must be corpses of bandits or the like who died violent deaths, turning them into evil spirits. Soon, those spirits would swarm those corpses, reanimate them, and use them to attack Guts. The horses drawing the wagon started getting spooked for no reason, so his claim about evil spirits showing up to kill them soon wasn't inaccurate. What was wrong was his assessment of the corpses he'd have to face. Turns out, they'd wandered onto a patch of land that used to be a battlefield at some point, because an entire battalion's worth of skeletons popped out of the ground, weapons in hand, ready to kill them all. The old man's daughter, Colette, gets out of the carriage hoping to calm down the horses enough for them to make an escape, but she gets impaled on one of the skeleton's spears. This angers Guts when he notices it, and he fires off, throwing knives in the direction of the skeleton zombies closest to him. Puck tries to convince him to finish what Colette started and get the hell out of there, because there were too many skeletons for them to deal with. But to his surprise, Guts takes a stand and tells him that this comes with the territory. The Black Swordsman draws Dragonslayer and starts clobbering his way through his reanimated enemies, and Puck is once again impressed by his ability to defeat any opponent, living or dead. His admiration gets interrupted in the worst way possible, however, because turns out the evil spirits managed to possess Colette's corpse and had her behead her own father. When Guts noticed this, he was stunned momentarily because he dragged an innocent child into his blood-smeared life. For all his talk about crushing weaklings underneath his boot like the ants that they were, Guts clearly had a soft spot for kids and didn't wish for his journey to bring harm to them. Wherever he could, he tried sparing them its horrors, and when it became inevitable, he told himself that it wasn't his fault. But that feeling of guilt and remorse never quite went away, and it had him motionless long enough for possessed Colette to jam a sword tip into his belly. As soon as he felt that, Guts' body reacted instinctively and cut her in half, but when his mind caught up with his reaction, he ended up puking. This didn't throw him off his game though. If anything, it made him fight even better. By the time the sun came up, he'd smashed every skeleton soldier trying to kill him into so many bones. Puck was in tears watching him fight, because A, he couldn't imagine living a life like that on the daily, and B, Colette. After he regained his breath, the Black Swordsman turned his gaze toward the young girl's corpse. Puck took it to mean he regretted his actions. He tried to soothe his conscience by telling him it wasn't his fault, but that just made Guts break out into his trademark maniacal laugh. He tells Puck that he's absolutely right, and reminds him of his stance on small fries that got in the way of someone else's fight. If someone can't live their lives freely, they might as well die, and Colette and her father simply lacked the strength to survive a walking disaster like him. That's all there was to it. He says that if he's always worried about crushing the ants underneath his boot, soon he wouldn't be able to walk, and the remnants of the spirits he just defeated start taunting him once again. Evil made its presence felt to Guts in the darkness. He'd be swarmed by spirits whenever he entered a region devoid of light, like a boarded home or a densely packed forest, and he was a night owl, not by choice, but by necessity. He could only sleep in the light of the sun, because that's where it was safest for him. So the fact that he could still hear the spirits wasn't surprising despite sunup, as he was still in the middle of a forest. They reminded him that he could never escape their clutches as long as he had his brand, and Guts replied by firing off his arm cannon to make them shut up. He quietly drapes his cloak around his chest and walks off into the sun as Puck comes to terms with the world Guts lives in. This chapter had him making far fewer moral arguments because he finally understood the true nature of Guts' life. It wasn't that he was a bad person, it's that his path was so dark that he didn't have time to be good. And besides, being good could end up becoming a weakness, which nearly happened when possessed Colette stabbed Guts. Chapter 2 of the Black Swordsman arc firmly established the grim reality of Guts' everyday life, and also explained how his brand works outside of scoping out apostles. It turned him into a walking disaster for anyone that wasn't strong enough to keep up with him, because his entire life would be like this until the moment he died. Considering his fighting style, that day won't be too far in the future, which is why he needed to find the God Hand quickly. So you can imagine how lucky he felt when his next target gave him the opportunity to do just that. The slug count and the behelit. Guts starts zeroing in on his real target. Chapter 3 of the Black Swordsman arc kicked off the third and final storyline of that arc, and it's perhaps the most important out of the three. The first chapter told us who Guts was and who his enemies were. The second chapter showed us how he suffered and struggled through his daily life. The third chapter was the beginning of unraveling the why of it all, as in why exactly was Guts so obsessed with killing demons that he was going from town to town, killing people left, right and center just to get his hands on them. Chapter 3 of the Black Swordsman arc, titled titled Guardians of Desire Part 1 opens with an execution. A woman accused of heresy has been condemned to the block. Once the minister of the town is done declaring her crimes to its people, she's executed. Before she died, she fervently protested the assertion that she was a heretic, and her frightened look stayed frozen on her decapitated head, along with a single tear. Once the deed was done, the minister climbed the steps of a tent that overlooked the execution stage, and instantly, this was a red flag to us. Whoever ruled this town had set up a pavilion tent at the stage where the death sentence was to be passed, as if it were a joust to enjoy. When Minister Dahl gives his legion update on the execution, he's commended for a job well done, but his warnings are dismissed. This was the 5th public execution they'd performed in the last month. The people were already terrified of their ruler, based off the reaction of the crowd. Dahl was worried about the Holy See involving itself in their affairs, but the Count remained unmoved. He ordered the minister to continue arresting anyone that looked like a spy or a drifter as a heretic, because it was all for the good of his people. He claims that a peaceful existence for his subjects was all that he desired, but Dahl's nervous gulp and the fact of the matter plainly stated otherwise. 5 public executions in a month are way too many, considering that sort of treatment is only reserved for traitors of the highest order. That the Count basically asked him to arrest anyone that looked suspicious was a sure-shot sign that he was a tyrannical dictator who achieved peace through crushing oppression. But another aspect of his heretic hunt was revealed alongside his true nature. The Count's men didn't even have the courtesy to clean up the scene of the execution. They let the accused's head roll off into the crowd, which is where Guts picks it up. He carves the brand of sacrifice in its forehead, smashes it in the face of a guard that tries to stop him, and flings it in the Count's direction. The man catches the head and is shocked to see the brand of sacrifice, because it could only mean one thing. The man staring daggers at him was the infamous Black Swordsman. The Count was confirmed to be an apostle when his presence made Guts' brand bleed, but he used its blood to perform the universal hand sign for a death sentence, and his message was received loud and clear. The Black Swordsman exited the scene as the Count geared up for war. His first move was sending his dogs after him. The Count's guards cornered Guts in an alley and ordered him to cooperate with them, since he was now accused of heresy. Guts responded by chopping down several of them with Dragon Slayer, armor and all. Against foot soldiers, he could keep doing this all day. Guts had killed enough apostles in his life for humans to even feel like a challenge. They were more like practice dummies to him, and he could cut down as many as he liked, provided he held the advantage. By showing his insane strength, he gained a psychological edge over his enemies, but he would have lost it had he not been saved by Puck. The elf distracts a pair of crossbowmen who were trying to ambush Guts from behind by blinding them with his Puck spark, and this gives his swordsman friend enough time to break the scaffold that they stood on. Puck puffs his chest out and claims that Guts owes him one for that assist, but Guts evens the debt almost immediately by saving him from one of the guards. After witnessing the incompetency of his men, their captain Zondark steps forward and challenges Guts, but he turns out to be a bigger tool than them. He thinks that his hulking frame and his giant warhammer are enough to keep Guts on the back foot, but he clearly overestimates himself, because the Black Swordsman shatters his weapon with a single counterattack, where Zondark couldn't even land a blow on him. Guts' move is so powerful that it sends shards of metal flying into Zondark's face, and he steps on the dude's head, hoping to make the rest back off. He isn't lucky enough to make that happen, because more and more soldiers kept showing up the longer he lingered there, and it's in this moment that he gets help from an unexpected ally. When Guts was taunting the Count in the public square, a hooded figure was watching his every move. That same figure threw smoke bombs in front of Guts so he could camouflage the man and cover their escape. He leads the swordsman and his elf companion to his humble abode, where he reveals himself as the former physician of the Count. His name was Vargas, and he used to work with the ruler of this unknown city many years ago. The Count was a dangerous man back then as well, but he had more purpose in his life than randomly accusing everyone of heresy. He took his inquisitorial duties very seriously, and he was cruel, but he was also human. So long as things stayed that way, Vargas had no objections working for him. But then, one day, the Count turned into something inhuman, and his heretic hunt turned into an excuse for piling up bodies to flay, slay, and violate before he devoured them. When Vargas discovered his secret, the Count locked him up and his entire family, and had his way with the latter. He ate Vargas's wife and children in front of him, and he'd cut off and eaten many parts of him as well. The only reason he was still alive was because of a medicine he developed to fake his death, which he used to escape the Count's clutches. That was 7 years ago, and in that time he'd only thought about one thing: revenge. But Vargas was in no condition to get his revenge with his own hands, so he was biding his time, waiting for a person that could help him get it, which is when Guts sauntered into his life. He was convinced that the Black Swordsman would help him, considering he looked like he had a grudge against the Count, but Guts rejected his request at first. He didn't want to get slowed down by yet another liability that he had no desire to protect. What changed his mind is the fact that this court physician was in possession of the only thing that could get him closer to his goal, a behelit. Turns out, before he escaped the Count's castle, he took his behelit along, and in the 7 years since that day, he's researched every aspect of occultism that he could get his hands on in a vain attempt to decipher its true nature. He never got anywhere, but he knew that it was after getting his hands on this behelit that the Count became more demonic in nature. He wanted to know more about this thing, which is when Guts piped up and told him exactly what a behelit is. He described it as a key that opened an interdimensional gateway and summoned demons called the God Hand. He had no idea how to use it, but he was hoping to learn that soon enough. Finding a behelit was an unprecedented development for Guts, because now he had the means to call his enemies to him. He just needed to figure out how. Vargas shared a map of the Count's castle with him, showing him the best path to get inside without getting detected. In return, he asked for only one thing, that the Black Swordsman used his power to avenge him, his wife, and his children. Vargas had no idea about Guts' no-touching rule, so he violates it and grabs him to make his plea. He gets kicked away for that and called a monster, a spineless freak for relying on someone else to get his revenge. If you hadn't picked up on it already, Guts absolutely hated weaklings like Vargas who would attach themselves to another just to get their way in life. He tells the physician that he will kill the Count, but it won't be for his vengeance. Before he can say anything more, the gathering is interrupted by the arrival of Zondark, who is no longer the same person Guts fought a day ago, and we do mean that, literally. The captain of the guards had suffered a humiliating defeat at the Black Swordsman's hands, and his thirst for revenge was driving him insane. Zondark was banging his head on a pillar when the Count walked in on him and asked him if he truly wanted revenge on their mutual enemy. Zondark immediately says yes. The Count smiles and tells him that he would give him his heart's desire. The Apostle makes Zondark swallow a parasitic slug that comes out of his mouth and bears his face, turning him into his personal daemon. This is yet another early Berserk concept that got retconned and repackaged later, because the term daemon is now associated with guiding astral spirits. In the Black Swordsman arc, the spelling of daemon includes an E, and later on, Miura replaces that E with an I to denote the term daemon's original Latin meaning, which is tutelary deity. The first daemon we see is Flora, which is appropriate considering she was the tutor of Shirka and became her guardian spirit following her own demise. Daemon with an E is replaced with the term pseudo-apostle, which prevents readers from getting confused between the two. Guts' second fight with Zondark is much tougher than his first. The first time, he didn't even engage the guy. He just let him wear himself out before hitting him with the appropriate counter. This time, Guts took a proper stance before engaging Zondark because he knew it would be necessary. Puck was once again impressed with his dazzling display of peak swordsmanship because while Zondark's battle axe was moving fast enough to be invisible to the naked eye, Guts was checking all of its blows. Puck is shocked to learn his callous traveling partner is actually a master swordsman, and Guts proves his worth by slicing off Zondark's arms and a part of his head. Usually, that'd be enough to finish off any human, but this was a pseudo-apostle. Zondark's head stump simply manifested a cruder form of the Count's visage, which proceeded to taunt Guts into keeping the battle going. He was slightly derailed by the presence of Vargas, which delighted him because he found two of his missing birds in one stroke, his former physician and his beloved behelit. The Count told Vargas he would see to him soon enough, and perhaps they could pick up where they left off back then, but right now, his focus was Guts. He got overzealous in wanting to be the one that kills the Black Swordsman because the Count collapsed Vargas' laboratory upon his medium's head and got trapped long enough for his targets to escape. Guts takes his leave of Vargas, but not before swiping his behelit as down payment for the Count's life. Puck is miffed with his indifference once again, but his time with Vargas highlights the true importance of the elf in the series. Before the two go their separate ways, Puck tells Vargas that he thinks people should go on living for the future and not for avenging the past. This statement is meant not just for the physician, but the Black Swordsman as well, because the elf could recognize the black desire for revenge in both their hearts. Puck's constant nagging and reprimanding Guts for his behavior wasn't just so he could come off as an annoying bug. It was a genuine attempt at rekindling the guy's humanity. As an empath, Puck could feel emotions keenly, and he never felt a mix of emotions so dark and violent as Guts. He keeps going back to him despite always getting insulted by him, because not only is Puck interested in Guts' life, he also wants to help the guy out of his misery. Vargas, at least, was receptive to his words and thanked Puck for his kindness, thinking he was a rather dear elf. Little did he know that would be his free thought, because soon after, he's taken hostage by pseudo-Zondark. While that was going down, Puck was doing his usual routine of teaching Guts how to behave properly, but once again, he got told that he was worthless, and that Guts would have punched that weakling Vargas to get his behelit. He broke down laughing at Puck's suggestion that they were allies, and straight up started ignoring him as he was taking stock of his gear. The elf got the hint and flew away, but when he was by himself, Guts' real thoughts and emotions toward Vargas started to surface. He'd ridiculed the man for being a maggoty creep that would only pull him down instead of being helpful, but now that he was alone for the first time in a while, Guts couldn't help but think of the similarities between them. The stump where his left arm used to be reminded him of Vargas' missing legs. His missing right eye reminded him of Vargas' his mutilated face. Guts touched his brand of sacrifice and recalled Vargas's words about what the Count did to his wife and daughter. All his injuries and his life experiences aligned with Vargas's, no matter how much he tried to deny it. His right eye was gouged out by an apostle. His left arm was devoured by an apostle. He was branded by the man he once looked up to as his leader, and now he hunted that same man to get revenge on him, just like Vargas. These similarities made Guts punch a hole in a brick wall out of frustration. He simply couldn't bring himself to empathize with the guy because empathy would open the floodgates to a whole host of emotions he needed to keep in check. If he let himself get swayed by every other man's revenge, he'd forget his own, and he was under no obligation to do so. It sounds pretty nihilistic and selfish, but those are the only things that have kept him alive for this long. It isn't as though he doesn't trust people. He just doesn't express it overtly because of the side effects that can have. While he was looking for a quiet spot to prepare for his fight with the Count, Guts overheard that Vargas was to be executed as a warning to him. He decided to attend it and see if he could get at the Count somehow. When Guts reached the execution site, he immediately figured out that it was a trap. Vargas was being executed way too soon after getting captured, and besides, he could see the Count soldiers lined up inside his castle, waiting for his arrival. As he observes the scene unfolding in front of him, Puck returns and starts frantically asking him if he was going to help Vargas or not. Guts points out the ambush waiting for him and tells the bug that Vargas should have known his limitations and lived like the rat that he was. But the self-hatred that was pouring out of him and into Puck revealed his hypocrisy. Guts had just given him a speech about how ambition too great can lead to self-destruction, but the elf flipped it on him by saying he was identifying with Vargas in that moment and that he too felt like he was fighting a losing battle. This triggered Guts and he nearly choked Puck, which startled him as well. Once he regained his composure, the Black Swordsman challenged the elf to go help out the old man if he was so worried about him. To his surprise, that's exactly what Puck does. He flies off in Vargas's direction, knowing he was powerless in this situation, and comically bounces off of the executioner's axe. But him showing up alone was sign enough for the condemned man to make one last heroic stand against his abuser. Vargas tells the Count that he was going to regret not being able to see what comes next, because death was about to visit this demon real soon. He yells out for the Black Swordsman to avenge him and the thousands before him that had died because of the Count's cruelty, and this sends Guts reeling. He was already struggling with the thought of feeling compassion for Vargas. His plea for vengeance sent him spiraling, and it was worsened by our third demon child sighting of the Ark. Perhaps it was this feeble flame of compassion that made him follow the men commanded to dispose of Vargas's body. He kills them and stares at the severed head of his accomplice, about to make a relatable comment on vengeance when he's reminded that they're not the same. Guts is swarmed by the tortured souls of all the people that have been executed by the Count, and they nearly manage to possess him in their desire for revenge. Guts screams them out of his body and reminds himself that this is his fight of a person with flesh and blood. The dead had no business getting in his way, and he'd be getting vengeance for himself and no one else. The Black Swordsman makes his way into the Count's castle using the secret passage Vargas had shown him, and he clears the two obstacles that stand in his way with haunting efficiency. Zondark vs. Guts 3 ends as quickly as it begins, because the Black Swordsman uses all his weapons to fight him this time around, not just his sword. He almost gets pinned by the pseudo-apostle, smashes his head on stone steps, and takes a devastating slash to the back. But he also finally kills Zondark in the process, and proceeds to clear out a hallway filled with 50 knights immediately after. Guts was already losing blood and dizzy from all his exploits, but he pressed on thanks to pure rage and hatred. After giving about a dozen fully armored knights the piñata treatment, he kills a guy as large as Zondark named Gediko with one body and pillar-splitting blow. That's enough to scare off the rest and lead Guts directly to his target, the Count. Their battle is the most intense apostle fight we see Guts having in the Black Swordsman arc, as everything about it plays out in favor of the apostle. The Count's released form is that of a huge demonic slug, which takes up a third of the space in his massive throne room. Cutting off this slug's limbs is pointless, because it can regrow them bigger and stronger than before. The only way to kill it is to treat it like it's pseudo and chop off its head. But with limited space to swing his sword around, Guts was already in trouble. He countered the Count's opening salvo handily enough, but when his decoy strategy only left a surface wound on the latter's head, he knew he was in for it. The demonic slug had blown open a massive hole in the side of his castle just by transforming. His blows were like steel beams slamming into Guts' body, and pretty soon, the apostle had the apostle hunter on his back. Slug Count grabbed Guts and slammed him into the walls and pillars of his throne room repeatedly, breaking many of his bones and making him bleed from his head. He respected the fact that a human had given him such a good fight, and a sacrifice at that. No doubt he intended to finish what was started 2 years ago and eat Guts to end his life, but that's when the tide of the battle changed, thanks to Puck. The elf showed up and called out the Slug Count's hypocritical stance on the fragility of humans, because he'd figured out the reason behind the Count becoming a demon. After his Vargas rescue mission failed, Puck was captured and taken as a present for the Count's daughter, Teresia. He was reluctant to trust her in the beginning, considering she was the daughter of a demon demon, but once they opened up to one another, it all started making sense. 7 years ago, the Count had bought his behelit from a group of traveling merchants who themselves had found it at an eastern bazaar. At that time, there was a particularly notorious group of heretics active in the region who threatened her mother's life if the Count didn't denounce the Holy See and started worshipping their god instead. The Count, of course, refused, being an ardent man of faith. So, the heretics carried out their threat and killed Teresia's mum, which is when everything changed. Since that day, she's never been allowed to leave her room, which is more like a prison now. The Count became a demon to escape the pain of his wife's death, and Puck caught onto this fact accurately, which is shocking coming from him. The apostle was taken aback by the elf's smarts as well, and offered to let him live if he cleared the area. But that's when the deciding factor of this battle came into play, the behelit. Just when the Count made up his mind to not kill Puck, the behelit Guts had taken from Vargas fell out of his pocket, and both of them made a play for it. Puck won, being smaller and having wings, but he didn't get far with it. His impudence and ignorance made him drop the behelit and freeze in fear at the Count's approach, and the only thing that saved him was his new friend, Teresia. Remember how we told you guys that when the Count transformed, he blew a hole in his castle's wall? Well, that same event also broke open the doors to Teresia's chambers, and she ended up leaving to look for Puck. What she found instead was proof that her father was a demon, and the Count lost all control upon seeing his daughter. He'd spent the last 7 years carefully hiding his true nature from her, hoping that she'd return his affections. But now, there was no point in being patient. He reached out for his daughter, but she ran away from him, which only pissed him off further. However, this little interaction is just what Guts needed to cover and get back into the fight. He lures the Count into attacking him and then pulls his daughter in front of him, knowing this would give him the advantage. The Black Swordsman blasts the demon slug with his arm cannon, which ends up breaking his fingers. So, he grabs Dragon Slayer with his teeth and runs him through, separating his head from his phallic body. Guts thinks the fight is over, so he decides to let off some steam by torturing the Count. We didn't know it at the time, but this was the same demon that had killed his friend Pippin during the eclipse, and Guts remembered him. He wants his daughter to feel the same pain he felt when his apostle friends dined on the Falcons, so he stabbed him over and over again with his dagger until it chipped, maniacally marveling at the Count's undying body. As Puck reprimands him for his decision and Teresia sheds tears in terror, it's the Count's scream that's most important in this scene because it holds within it the answer Guts had been looking for. He wasn't paying attention at the time, but his repeated stabbings had made the apostle lose so much blood that he was on the brink of death. The Count didn't want to die before making things right with his daughter or killing Gus. His intense despair at his current condition and his desire for life were mixed with his blood, which conveniently flowed towards the behelit. In order to escape death, the Count needed more power, and it was at the moment he craved said power that his blood, which was touching the behelit, activated. When that happens, the entire world changes, and Guts, Puck, Teresia, and the Slug Count are transported to a place with the most bizarre architectural planning. The non-Euclidean geometry of this space is reminiscent of the Forbidden Cities from H.P. Lovecraft's works. Gus immediately recognizes it as being another dimension. He'd known how the behelit worked in theory for a long time, but he'd never actually been able to put that knowledge to use. Now, thanks to a stroke of fate, he was present for the use of this key firsthand, and he was too absorbed in his own malice to even notice it until he was already transported. And once that happened, Guts had little to no time to even think straight, because he told Vargas the behelit summons the God Hand, and their mere presence is enough to incapacitate him, thanks to his brand of sacrifice. The God Hand's advent and the rivalry at the heart of Berserk. For 2 years, Guts had been looking for faint signs and listening to whispers on the wind, trying to get to the God Hand. He knew that the apostles were their servants, so finding them was his first solution. That was easy enough considering his brand of sacrifice helped him locate them via pain and bleeding. But every apostle he hunted said the same thing as the last one before them. They had no idea how to get to the God Hand. Maybe they were lying to protect their masters, or maybe they were telling the truth and they really didn't know. Neither answer got Guts any closer to his goals, which is why he was so grateful for Vargas's behelit. The Black Swordsman might not have known how it works, but he clearly knew its purpose rather intimately. That's because his life had been changed by it as well, and we learn how in the final 2 chapters of the Black Swordsman arc. As soon as the God Hand makes its presence felt, Guts falls to the ground, writhing in pain, his brand gushing blood like a broken faucet. We'd seen him experience these things before, but never with such intensity, and the reason for it was clearly the God Hand. Turns out, the more powerful a demon is, the stronger the brand's reaction is to their presence. And if a demon was as powerful as the God Hand, the pain of the brand could be great enough to kill a person. But none of that matters, because in front of his eyes was the man he'd been chasing for the past 2 years, Griffith. That was the name of the God Hand member who looked like he was wearing a latex bodysuit with attached wings and and a helmet in the shape of a falcon's beak. Kentaro Miura was inspired by Clive Barker's Hellraiser for the design of his main villains, and it clearly shows. The God Hand member Void has an exposed skull and brain, with a priest's hood that's reminiscent of Pinhead. Ubik is a talkative little floating demon with a perma grin stuck to his face, like Chatterer. Slan is clearly a parallel for the female Cenobite, and Conrad looks and behaves like Butterball. The original Hellraiser only had 4 Cenobites, with their evil god Leviathan being the unseen guiding force of their lives. This 5th demonic angel was Miura's addition to that concept, and his demon name was Femto, like that ephemeral unit of measurement. He joined the 4 original God Hand members 2 years before the Black Swordsman arc, in the event which was responsible for Guts' branding, the Eclipse. However, Guts didn't acknowledge his current existence as a demon king, and continued to call him by his human name, which was Griffith. In a flashback from the final chapter of the arc, we see that Guts used to be Griffith's soldier at one point in time. After a particularly gnarly battle, his leader comes to check up on him and is surprised to see him still alive among a pile of corpses. Griffith says he must have the luck of the devil and pulls Guts back up to his feet. He says that on the field of battle, a soldier's life is worth less than 1 silver coin, and they don't even die for their own sake. Their lives are controlled by nobility. Of course, even the king isn't free to do as one pleases. All humans seem to be caught up in the tide of something greater than them, and most of them die before even figuring out who they were meant to be. In life, regardless of one's wealth or social status, there were only a handful of people who made it go round. Those people were the true elites, the ones destined to set the world in motion as its keys. Griffith wanted to know what his destiny was amongst theirs, and he found it funny that he was sharing such a core belief of his so candidly with a soldier. At that time, he shined like an unattainable ideal in the swordsman's eyes. He felt so noble, so larger than life, that Guts must have continued to fight for him just to help him figure out his destiny. Clearly, that changed at one point, because Griffith was now Femto, and Guts was no longer interested in helping other people. Puck picks up on the fact that whatever happened between these two is what made Guts the way he is, but we don't get a clue as to what that could be, perhaps because Miura hadn't come up with all the details for the eclipse yet. He just knew that it was going to happen, and that Guts and Griffith would end up coming out of it as enemies. He built in the context for that enmity in this interaction though, because Femto's first reaction to seeing Guts was ridicule him for squirming around in his pathetic existence as a sacrificial offering. The God Hand wasn't here to address Guts. Their business was with the Count. He was the one whose desperate desire to cling to life and activated the Behelit and summoned them, because it was ordained by the laws of fate. Miura later gives fate the name causality and fleshes it out properly during his writing sessions for the eclipse, but for now, all we needed to know was that this interaction was meant to happen. The Archangel of the God Hand, Void, addresses the Count directly and waits for him to make his demand because they'd gone through this once before. The Count wishes for his masters to take the Black Swordsman's life because he was their collective enemy and the reason he personally was at death's door, but his request was rejected. The God Hand explained that they couldn't take Guts as a sacrificial offering because the Count had no personal hatred towards the guy, and more than that, his true desire wasn't revenge, it was to escape death. Besides, Guts had already been branded by their kinsman, Femto, and a person couldn't be offered as a sacrifice 2 times. The God Hand is also amused by the Apostles' claim that someone like Guts could be their enemy, and ridicules him for thinking that the deaths of a few inconsequential servants like him meant anything to them. As Slug Count struggles to figure out the true meaning of their cryptic words, Guts stands up, broken fingers and bleeding brand and all, and starts making his way toward Griffith. The God Hand had made the mistake of pricking his ego by calling him inconsequential as well, and Guts couldn't swallow such an insult, knowing that Griffith wouldn't be where he is today without him. The Black Swordsman lugs his sword up the staircase upon which his target stands, berating him for thinking he was some kind of god when it took Guts' human flesh and blood for him to attain that power. He nearly passes out because of the pain of being so close to a God Hand, and Femto mocks him for his ignorance. But somehow, Guts manages to fight back even that pain, and lands a decent swing at his enemy. Well, almost, considering he gets knocked flat on his ass and out cold by Femto's spatial powers, but his burst of tenacity impressed the rest of the God Hand. Slan considered it a shame that they couldn't have him become a part of their ranks, and Femto assumed that he'd killed his worthless sacrificial offering, so they continued to press the Count into making a sacrifice. The Apostle tried to get crafty and suggested Guts a second time, but they told him that wouldn't work for the reasons we mentioned a few moments ago, and one more. In exchange for reincarnation, not just any lump of flesh would suffice as a sacrifice. It must be someone who's so close to the Count that losing them would be like losing a part of his soul. The Count had already done it once with his wife. Turns out, she wasn't killed by a group of heretics. She was a heretic herself, being a member of a pagan sex cult. The Count discovered this fact while his wife was in the middle of an occult ritual. It sent him into a blind rage. He killed every pagan he could find within his castle, except for one, his wife. The Count couldn't bring himself to kill her because he loved her so much, so he tried to kill himself. That's when his blood hit the behelit the first time and summoned the God Hand. Upon seeing them, the Count begged them to take away his pain and sorrow, and they gave him the offer of becoming an unfeeling, undying demon in exchange for one thing, his beloved wife. Because the Count was pissed at her betrayal, he overlooked his love and sacrificed her, thus becoming a gluttonous demonic slug. Now, if he wanted to repeat those results, he'd have to cut away the last remnant of his humanity, that being his daughter, Theresia. In order to force a decision, Void performs the invocation of doom and summons the fiery brand that'll mark Theresia for a sacrifice should the Count accept. And the God Hand also decides to show him what'll happen should he reject their offer. Femto points a finger and summons the fate of all those who get entangled with demonkind. A giant abyss appears in the heart of the interstice, and from that abyss emerges a vortex of countless tortured souls. This is Berserk's version of hell, and what awaited the Count should he refuse the God Hand. Each moment he wasted making a decision drew his soul closer to hell, and if he failed to make a choice before time ran out, it would end up becoming a part of that infernal vortex. He could avoid it by sacrificing his daughter, which is what the God Hand wanted, and that threat almost worked, until the Count caught sight of her. If he were to accept the God Hand's deal, Theresia would be branded with the brand of sacrifice and end up becoming an offering to demonkind as well. He could have extended his time on Earth by doing so, but then he'd be condemning his daughter to the same hell he wanted to escape, and that he couldn't do. The Count let the counter on his life run out, and his soul was dragged into the abyss by that endless vortex. All Theresia and Puck could do was stare at his life come to an end, but Guts was shocked to see that one of the souls dragging the Count to hell was Vargas. The court physician had died a regretful death, filled with hatred and the desire for vengeance. He was also an accomplice of the Count's many cruelties even before he became a demon. Seeing him in the abyss was surprising for Guts, but perhaps it wasn't unexpected. However, he couldn't waste time thinking about that because he had bigger problems to attend to. Once the souls were done with the Count, they came for him, seeing as he was a sacrifice. They got their hands on Guts' legs and would have taken him with them had he not come up with a last-second solution. The Black Swordsman was heavily injured, unable to move his arms even, but he couldn't die without firing off a parting shot. He loaded up his arm cannon and shot it in Griffith's direction. The impact of the blast made the souls drop him altogether, but it had no effect on the Falcon. He simply used his spatial powers to tank it in its path, and the God Hand disappeared shortly after. Once they were back in the physical world, Guts and Puck had to deal with the aftermath of what had just happened in the form of a panicking Theresia. The young girl had been spared from becoming a sacrificial offering, but that didn't mean that she was all right. She'd just seen her father turn into a demon, learned that he became that way by sacrificing and eating her mum, and had nearly been sacrificed herself. Despite all these horrific events, she clearly loved him and reached out to his soul as it was being pulled to hell to try and keep it alive. When all that failed, she wanted to go back to her room and reject reality or kill herself. So Guts tossed her a knife. Puck was livid with him enabling Theresia in such a sensitive state, but Guts just asked the elf what would be so bad about it. Puck had asked him to give up and die during his battle with the Slug Count out of concern. Here, Theresia wanted to do it. If she committed suicide, she'd probably go to heaven because she was doing it out of love. Even if she went to hell, at least she'd be reunited with her parents again. If either option sounded better than living to her, then why shouldn't she kill herself? Puck had no response for Guts, so he tries reasoning with Theresia, who had picked up his dagger and was about to follow through with his suggestion. But just then, the floor underneath her caves in and she falls with it. Theresia would have died had the Black Swordsman been as heartless as Puck thought he was, because Guts instinctively catches her with his sword. We told you guys that he had a soft spot for children, and no matter how cruel he was to them with his words, he'd never let that spill over into his actions. He saved Theresia because he didn't want her to die, and felt guilty about using his sword to do it because it cut her palms open. And then his guilt was accentuated by her blame, because when death was denied to her by the man who offered it to her in the first place, she decided she was going to kill him instead. Theresia blamed Guts for ruining her life and everything that had happened since he came into her life, so she promised to kill him one day, and this was familiar territory to him. The Black Swordsman simply tells the little girl to bring it on, and then he'd wait for her before walking out of the Count's castle. But as he leaves, he has tears in his eyes, and Puck realizes that he doesn't really want to fight Theresia. Underneath all his angst and malice, Guts was driven by a deep sadness and fear. Beneath all of that, he had the kind heart of of a gentleman. It was the darkness of having to fight demons like the God Hand that he became as rough as he was, and the elf recognized the necessity of this coping mechanism. Puck sticks around Guts for the rest of his journey because he wants to help Guts, but also because he now knows there's some hope for him yet. He isn't the heartless bastard that he makes himself out to be, and if he could just work out a way to make him feel as human as he does in the aftermath of making enemies of children, he could bring Guts out of his blood-soaked past. As for the Black Swordsman, his inner malice had won him a great victory and given him an important asset for his impossible task, but the more he kept at it, the heavier his sword became. Guts had no idea how much longer he'd have to keep fighting these fatalistic battles, but he was prepared to do so because he needed to land a punch on Griffith's face soon, and not the invisible wall that surrounded him. Marvelous verdict. Like we mentioned at the beginning, the Black Swordsman arc is a near-perfect introduction to any dark fantasy manga, period. It sets up the core concepts of Berserk while retaining their mystique and fleshing out its main character without revealing major hints about his background. It teases the core conflict of the series in such a way that we had no choice but to binge read the entire Golden Age arc once we were done with this one. Exploring one of the greatest 8-chapter arcs in manga history was an utter pleasure for us. We hope you enjoyed watching this video as much as we enjoyed making it. And always remember, keep struggling, strugglers.